If you're into VR games with intense methodical combat, then Grimlord is definitely something you'll want to check out. This game channels that gritty, challenging feel that Dark Souls types love, but with the added layer of virtual reality, making combat feel that much more immersive. This game is still in early access though, so let's dive right in and find out what it's like now, and if it's on the right path for its release scheduled later this year, starting with the graphics. And I've gotta say, I'm pretty impressed with Grimlord's graphics. Sure, there are some textures that stand out as noticeably rough, but they're blended into the overall environment in a way that makes the game look visually appealing. Despite a few minor issues, the aesthetic as a whole works really well here. The game defaults to high graphical settings, and that's what I use throughout my playthrough. It's also the baseline graphical setting I use to review all VR games. And even at these higher settings, the game performs surprisingly well. I've reviewed VR titles with worse graphics and far worse performance, so it's refreshing to see Grimlord run smoothly given how good it looks. One thing that definitely stood out to me is how much the level design and overall visual style reminds me of the Dark Souls series. That dark medieval vibe, the towering structures, and the eerie environments all channel that same haunting atmosphere. Even the ragdoll effects on the NPCs are pretty impressive. You can actually move their limbs around, which is very unexpected but very entertaining, all things considered. Another standout area of this game is in the audio, and the voice acting in Grimlord is surprisingly good. Honestly, I'm as impressed here as I was with the graphical performance.
You'll have my support, my trust, and my faith. You need to be stronger if you wish to make it out there.
Now, this is still an early access title, so there are some bugs here and there that often interrupt the dialogue, but more on that later when we go over the mechanics. As for the sound effects, they do a great job at reinforcing the atmosphere. The sharp clash of metal on metal during combat sounds convincing enough to keep you immersed if you're anything short of an audiophile. And that's really the mark of good sound design, when it blends into the experience so seamlessly that you hardly notice its shortcomings. Now, when it comes to the theme, Grimlord definitely channels a strong Dark Souls vibe. From the moment you step into this world, the dark medieval atmosphere hits you, and it hits you hard. The enemies move like they're driven purely by instinct rather than AI, attacking with a kind of subtle ferocity that really adds to the game's brutal feel, with the exception of the locked-in multi-hit combos, of course. That said, the story itself will be a little hard to grasp, at least in its current early access state. The dialogue kept doing this strange auto-skip thing, which made it difficult to follow the narrative.
They don't really hurt me.
Good news is that I'm confident this is just one of those bugs that'll be worked out in future updates. There's clearly a deeper lore here, but right now, the bugs make it difficult to immerse yourself in it. The surface is scratched, but it feels like much of the content remains untapped for now with the limited environments you have access to. The game gives off the impression that there's a lot more beneath the surface, but until more is fleshed out, the story and lore remain on the back burner, if you don't feel like doing your research outside of the game, of course. But moving on to the mechanics, the combat in Grimlord is genuinely fun, though it has its quirks. The fighting system uses a physics-based approach, or at least something close to it, which is always the most realistic way to simulate combat in VR. Swinging a sword feels satisfying here, and there is a simulated weight behind your movements. That said, there are a few bugs that can take you out of the moment. For example, you can't freely change the orientation of your weapon yet. So if you're trying to switch up how you hold your weapons, it can get a little awkward, especially in moments where the game suggests you climb a wall by stabbing it. This kind of thing definitely needs some refinement. One feature I did like is how the game uses the more immersive body slot system for holstering weapons. This has always been my preferred method in VR games. However, these slots don't always function as intended, which can lead to some tricky situations where your weapon doesn't equip or unequip when you need it to. As for the dialogue system, I'm not entirely sure I figured out how it's supposed to work yet, but I think it's just bugged. The game uses the head nod and head shake system for making choices, and while I appreciate the immersion factor, it sometimes requires you to nod with enough force to make your neck soar. It's an interesting concept that worked very well in Stellar Plans, another game I reviewed on the channel, but the execution here could use some tweaks in comparison. On the positive note, we've seen some real progress from the developers. Back in June, they released some updates showing what they've been working on, and it's clear they're putting in the effort to improve the game. Originally, I had my doubts about whether Grimlord would be ready for its end-of-year release target, but seeing the strides they've made since then gives me a bit of hope, especially considering they still have the rest of the year to finish fleshing out the game. Now I'll briefly touch on the options, but in a nutshell, Grimlord's options includes most of the settings I expected to find. The menu itself is pretty simplistic, and while I tend to prefer more immersive menus in VR games, this one gets the job done well enough. It's straightforward and easy to navigate, even if it doesn't wow you with a flashy interface. It's early access, so I wasn't expecting much more than this anyway. And at the very least, you have a vignette option and the option to play seated. So overall, when you get past the noticeable bugs, Grimlord does a good job pulling you into this world. The combination of the dark atmospheric environments, the fun combat, and the physics-ish mechanics really sells the vibe I feel they're going for. As it stands, the game has a lot of potential, and with more polish, this game could give birth to some truly memorable VR moments like the end of Half-Life Alyx. Grimlord's foundation is strong, and if the developers continue to refine the experience, this could become one of the most immersive VR games out there. We can't score this game like usual because it is in early access, but don't miss my review on this game when it does fully release. Subscribe to that and like this video if you enjoyed it before you check out one of the other reviews that could lead to you buying your next VR game. Until next time, stay immersed.